Even the most enigmatic disappearances of people, which leave no trace, eventually find their explanations over time. Those missing either make contact themselves, or the police manage to dig deep enough to uncover the truth and solve the case. Unfortunately, unsolved crimes involving abductions and serious crimes do occur, though they are much rarer. However, sometimes the investigation is just one step away from a breakthrough, but for some reason, the full picture remains elusive. The case of a young Canadian woman named Alicia Ross, who vanished without a trace in the middle of the night from her own bedroom, would likely have remained unsolved. The police were unable to find either a body or any significant evidence, and as a result, the investigation merely stagnated, attempting to stitch together a case against an innocent person who was suspected from the start. It might have ended up that way had the criminal not turned himself in to the police. It's hard to determine whether a sudden onset of conscience or a mental disorder was the cause, though it was probably a combination of both. But let's start from the beginning and dissect this complex story with an unexpected twist. Who was Alicia Ross? Alicia Ross was born on February 8, 1980, in the Canadian city of Markham, in the province of Ontario. There is no information about her biological parents. It is only known that they relinquished their rights to the child, and she was adopted at a few months old by a couple named Marvin and Sharon Ross. Her adoptive parents surrounded her with love and care. They did everything to ensure that their daughter wanted for nothing and could fully develop her talents. When Alicia started school, her adoptive parents decided to divorce, but they maintained a friendly relationship and continued to participate together in their daughter's life. Soon, Sharon remarried, and her new husband, named Julius Forrest, treated the child as if she were his own daughter. The girl did well in school, excelled in drawing, and also had a passion for photography and loved discovering new cities and countries. After finishing school, she spent a year in Australia, where she traveled and enjoyed life before returning home and enrolling in university. In the summer of 2005, the 25-year-old Alicia went on a hiking trip in the mountains with her friends. She loved spending time in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. There, she met a young man named Shawn Hine, with whom she began a romantic relationship in early July. He was 4 years her senior. He was already 29 at the time, but the slight age difference did not bother the couple. At that time, Ross still lived in her adoptive parents' home, where she occupied the basement with a separate entrance, thus having her own space and living independently from her parents. On August 16th, the young woman, together with her adoptive mother and their dogs, went for a walk in the park. Alicia appeared happy and shared that she was expecting a promotion at work to the position of senior sales manager in the coming days. She was very proud, as she had been working hard for a long time, and her efforts were finally about to pay off. Additionally, the young woman talked to her mother about her boyfriend Shawn, whom she had been dating for just over a month, but seemed deeply in love. Alicia hoped that this romance could develop into something more significant in the future, and expressed a desire to introduce her beau to her adoptive parents by arranging a family dinner. After the walk in the park, the mother headed home, and her daughter went on a date with her beloved, promising not to stay out late because she needed to get up early for work the next day, where her promotion was to be decided. The women said goodbye and went their separate ways. Sharon never saw her daughter alive again, the mysterious disappearance from her own home. That evening, after meeting with Shawn, Alicia invited him to her house. They had a great time together, and close to midnight, the young man left for home. Alicia walked him to the gate, which served as a second exit from the yard. They kissed goodbye, and then he left, promising to call her as soon as he got home. Around midnight, as promised, Shawn called his girlfriend, but she didn't pick up the phone. He wasn't overly concerned, thinking Alicia had simply fallen asleep since she had to get up early for work. However, the next morning, when he tried to call her again and she still didn't pick up, he became genuinely worried and contacted a mutual acquaintance who worked in the same office with Ross. From her, he learned that Alicia hadn't come to work, and he immediately rushed to her house. On the morning of August 17th, Sharon and Julius were planning to play golf with friends, and they left the house around 10 o'clock. They noticed their daughter's car in the driveway but thought little of it, assuming a colleague had picked her up. So the couple went about their day. About half an hour later, Shawn arrived at the Ross residence, and finding no sign of Alicia there, he called the police to report a person missing. He also immediately contacted Sharon, informing her of the situation. The couple, alarmed by the news, dropped everything and hurried home, where the police were already present by then. Thus, Shawn Hine was the first person to notice the girl's disappearance and to inform the authorities. Moreover, he was the last person to see Alicia alive and well the evening before she vanished. According to him, they had said goodbye at the gate, where his car was parked around midnight, and she hadn't been in touch since then, with her whereabouts unknown. When Sharon and Julius approached the house, law enforcement was already there, inspecting the area and speaking with Shawn, who had called them. The young man was visibly nervous and looked distraught. When the mother looked into Alicia's room, she immediately noticed that all her daughter's personal belongings, without which she never left the house, were in their places. Her purse, passport, driver's license, keys, cell phone, as well as her bank cards and cash, were all left in the room, indicating she wouldn't have gone anywhere, let alone left without them. The gate was open but not forced, suggesting that the missing person either let her abductor in herself or willingly left with someone from the yard. In the backyard, the police found some disorder. The lawn and flowers in one spot were trampled as if someone had fallen there. Also, a pair of cigarettes and the right sandal of the girl, one she had been wearing the evening before, were found on the ground, laid out in a straight line. Neither Alicia nor her parents smoked, so the cigarettes didn't belong to them, and Shawn claimed he never smoked that particular brand, leaving it unclear to whom they belonged and why they were arranged in such a strange manner. The prime suspect. Shawn was almost immediately considered the prime suspect. Firstly, he was noticeably nervous, and his account seemed somewhat confused and disjointed. Secondly, he was the first to report his girlfriend's disappearance to the police, even before speaking with her parents and confirming that they too had not seen her. Thus, he definitely knew she was missing. Additionally, law enforcement found biological traces on the girl's bed, belonging both to her and Shawn. Based on this, the investigation speculated that Alicia might have denied Shawn intimacy, and he decided to force her, then, trying to cover his tracks, staged her disappearance, which he likely caused by ending her life. When Shawn was brought to the station, questioned, and the investigator's theory presented to him, the young man was stunned. He was dismayed to be the prime suspect and swore he would never harm his girlfriend as he loved her. He also admitted that they did indeed have intimate moments that evening, but insisted it was consensual. The missing girl's parents also had nothing bad to say about Shawn. He hadn't argued with their daughter, hadn't mistreated her, and she spoke only well of him, their relationship progressing rapidly and quite happily, so much so that Alicia even hoped to have a future with him. Moreover, the Forreses noted that their daughter had no plans or reasons to leave. She was eagerly awaiting a promotion at her beloved job, and being a responsible person, she would never just leave everything behind. But even if some unforeseen circumstances had arisen, she would certainly have informed her parents and definitely would not have left without her documents, money, and phone. The police lacked sufficient evidence or grounds to detain Shawn, and so after questioning him at the station, they released him. Nevertheless, law enforcement did not rule him out as a suspect and continued to keep an eye on the young man. Shawn himself appeared depressed and very upset. The extensive search effort. The search for the missing woman commenced the day after her disappearance. Initially, a thorough inspection of the home and yard was conducted, and investigators closely examined the surrounding area and interviewed neighbors. However, no one reported hearing or seeing anything suspicious that night. Law enforcement theorized that the woman vanished sometime between midnight, when she said goodbye to Shawn, and sunrise, a time when the streets are usually quiet and deserted, making it difficult to find witnesses. Flyers with Alicia's photos were distributed throughout the city, listing phone numbers where people could provide any information about her whereabouts. The story of the missing woman was featured in the news and made headlines in popular publications, generating significant public interest and prompting hundreds of volunteers and concerned citizens to join the search. The police received dozens of calls daily related to the case. Although most information turned out to be false or mistaken, each tip and theory was investigated in the hope of finding any leads. The search area continually expanded, involving more people, and thorough checks were conducted in abandoned buildings, wooded areas, and wastelands. Shawn also actively participated in the search efforts, despite still being the prime suspect. Feeling wronged, the young man turned to the media and gave a significant interview, where he shared how deeply he loved Alicia and displayed photos of them looking very happy together. He tearfully pleaded for help in the search, appearing utterly devastated by the situation. The search for Ross became one of the most extensive operations in Ontario's history. Every difficult-to-reach place, ravine, and marshy area was scoured, but no clues, leads, or even hints about the missing woman's location were found. Her parents also appealed to the public through the media, expressing their belief that their daughter was alive but being held against her will somewhere. They implored whoever had their daughter to let her return home unharmed and not to harm her in any way. Shawn's unexpected arrest. The police leaned towards the theory that someone Alicia knew personally had abducted and possibly ended her life. This hypothesis was supported by the lack of signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, and the gate being left open, but no concrete leads were found. The cigarettes found on the ground bore only a heavily smeared fingerprint, which couldn't be identified. Investigators thoroughly checked Alicia's contacts and reviewed all calls and messages on her phone and email, yet nothing suspicious was uncovered. On the 6th day of the search, the case was officially reclassified as a criminal act, despite the lack of evidence, and Shawn remained the prime suspect. Shawn lived alone in his own house about 10 miles from Alicia's home. After realizing that public suspicion had intensified following his media appearance, he stopped participating in the search and refused to speak with the press. Investigators interviewed Shawn 3 more times, but his story remained consistent. He was then offered a lie detector test, which he refused, convincing the police even more firmly that he was involved in the crime. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Shawn was arrested on an unrelated charge. He was taken into custody late at night for driving under the influence and resisting arrest. Speculations arose that he was drowning his guilt in alcohol. Following Shawn's arrest, Alicia's parents gave another interview, sharing that they had not personally known the young man and only knew about him through their daughter's accounts. They believed she was happy, but now Sharon considered the possibility that her daughter might have withheld certain details to avoid upsetting them, though she had planned to introduce her boyfriend to her family soon. Police interviewed Shawn's neighbors to determine if they had noticed anything unusual recently, such as him disposing of large trash bags, behaving suspiciously, leaving unexpectedly, or cleaning his car. However, no significant information emerged from these inquiries. Detectives were left hoping that Shawn might eventually confess to everything, an unexpected turn in the case. About a month after the disappearance of Alicia, the buzz surrounding her case began to fade gradually. The search continued, but it was no longer featured in newspapers or news broadcasts, and the investigation seemed to have hit a dead end. The only option left for law enforcement was to keep pressing Shawn, hoping he would crack and confess to everything. Then a completely unexpected twist occurred in the case. On September 20th, 2005, more than a month after Ross disappeared, 31-year-old Daniel Sylvester, who lived nearby, called the police and confessed to ending the girl's life, pointing out where he had hidden her body. It's important to note that this man was never under suspicion. and the police had not considered him at all during their investigation. Initially, it seemed that the man simply craved fame and attention, and thus decided to take responsibility for the most notorious case in recent years. However, all doubts were dispelled when the police found the girl's body at the location he had indicated. Who is Daniel Sylvester? But let's first delve into who this new person of interest is, and why the police hadn't taken an interest in him earlier. Daniel Sylvester was an unemployed recluse living in his mother's house, which was adjacent to the Ross family home. Their properties were separated by overgrown shrubs, forming a virtually impenetrable barrier. Although the criminal and the victim had lived practically their whole lives side by side, they had never interacted before. Alicia had seen Daniel a few times on his property and considered him mentally unwell because of his odd behavior. Indeed, he had had serious socialization issues from an early age, never had friends, was mocked at school, and every attempt at forming relationships ended in complete failure, causing him to harbor a deep resentment towards all women. As a child, girls called him a loser and said they would never associate with someone like him. At the age of 8, Sylvester was diagnosed with socialized behavioral disorder and had been under continuous psychological care, although therapy didn't help much. In his teenage years, he confessed that he dreamt of suddenly attacking a girl and overpowering her. This thought excited him, but specialists were confident that such fantasies would remain just in his imagination. After finishing school, Daniel stopped attending therapy sessions, decided not to continue his education, and became a recluse. He lived in his mother's house, almost completely isolating himself from the outside world. He spent his days sitting in his room, often on adult websites, and occasionally ventured out in the evenings to secretly watch his neighbors, peeping into their windows. He especially enjoyed watching when someone was engaging in lovemaking. This spectacle excited him, yet Daniel remained a virgin well into his 30s, satisfying himself with solitary activities. The neighbors hardly ever saw him, and thus considered him a harmless guy. The mutilated body. Initially, Sylvester claimed that the girl's death was accidental, and he hid the body to avoid punishment. According to him, when he realized the girl showed no signs of life, he placed her in the trunk of his mother's car and drove about 50 miles out of town, hiding the body in a bushy ravine by the side of a country road. 3 weeks later, fearing that the body would be discovered, he moved it in the middle of the night even further away, to a deserted area. The body was found in the place Daniel indicated, thereby dispelling the last doubts about his guilt. However, the condition of the remains indicated that the girl had been dealt with extreme cruelty. The injuries were such that it looked as if she had been hit by a car. An autopsy showed that Alicia had nearly all her ribs broken, her neck, both arms, and also suffered extensive closed cranial trauma with internal bleeding. The exact cause of death could not be determined, but at least 3 injuries were incompatible with life. Forensic experts were shocked, as they had never encountered anything like it before. It was now necessary to clarify all the circumstances and chronology of events of that fateful evening to learn how exactly the girl received such injuries. The full picture and chronology of events. Initially, the convict claimed that he had an argument with his neighbor on a bush-covered path between their homes. At some point during the verbal altercation, she called him a loser, which angered him, and he struck the girl on the head. When she fell, he kicked her several times in the chest. When he realized she was not breathing, he decided to hide the body, and then moved it again when the search area expanded. However, something in his story did not add up. There were missing details and specifics. For instance, it was unclear what Daniel was doing at his neighbor's house at night, why they began arguing, what caused such a brutal beating, and why the evidence found at the scene was laid out in a straight line. Restoring the full picture of events was challenging, but law enforcement managed to do so. That evening, Sylvester went out to spy on his neighbors. He noticed that Alicia's boyfriend had come over, and he approached their house closely. As the couple was being intimate, he watched them from a window. Then he moved back to the bushes, but did not leave. Closer to midnight, the lovers went outside and kissed by the gate, just a couple of feet away from the lurking neighbor. When Shawn left, the girl returned to the yard and noticed Daniel. She became very angry, realizing that he had been spying on her and her boyfriend all this time. She started yelling at him, calling him a pervert, and demanded that he leave immediately. Finally, Ross called him a loser, after which she turned around and was about to go back into the house. But this last word acted as a trigger, because that's exactly what other girls had called him in childhood. Sylvester was filled with rage, punched the girl powerfully on the head, and knocked her to the ground. She tried to resist and grabbed her attacker's hair, but he began to choke her. When his grip loosened, Daniel quickly stood up and began kicking Alicia while she lay down. He mostly struck her chest, back, neck, and head. Forensic experts later counted 33 fractures on the victim's body and extensive internal bleeding. When the man realized that his neighbor was dead, he moved her body to his garage, stripped her naked, and then masturbated according to his statement to relieve tension. The examination confirmed that Sylvester did not violate the body. He then put the corpse in the trunk of his mother's car and took it to a secluded place outside the city. Upon returning home, the criminal took a shower, changed clothes, and behaved as if nothing had happened. His clothes, as well as the victim's belongings and the towels he used to clean the crime scene, were packed in trash bags and disposed of. The trial and sentence. The court proceedings for this case began only in April 2007, at which time new details were made public. The defendant confessed that he ended his neighbor's life, but he and his lawyer insisted that it was unintentional. Moreover, the defense demanded a psychiatric evaluation, noting that Daniel was ill and should not be held accountable for his actions, suggesting he be treated in a clinic instead of being incarcerated. However, the prosecution argued that despite his mental illness and issues with anger management, Sylvester acted with full awareness of the consequences of his actions. He mercilessly kicked the girl with full force, knowing that it would likely result in her death. Nevertheless, the ordered psychiatric evaluation confirmed that the defendant could indeed be fully responsible for his actions. Regarding the items found in the backyard, Daniel never confessed to having placed them there, arranged in a straight line. On May 7, 2007, the defendant was found guilty of second-degree crime and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 16 years. A year later, Canadian singer-songwriter Kathleen Edwards wrote a song titled Alicia Ross, which depicted the events from the young woman's perspective during the last minutes of her life. The streets were dark and mostly empty. A young woman hurried out the door of her house, leashed her dog, and quickly got behind the wheel of the parked car. The car sped up and disappeared into the city's darkness. For the young runaway, it was the happiest night she had waited for 4 long years. Today, we will visit Lawrence, Kansas, and learn all about the life of this young woman and understand what made that particular night the happiest one for her. So if you're interested in finding out more about what happened, let's start from the beginning and share everything we know. Lawrence is a small town with a population of less than 100,000 people, ranked among the top 10 college towns. It's a wonderful place to live with minimal criminal activity. However, this incident completely disrupted the town's peace. On January 15, 2014, a young man contacted the local police department to report a disturbing, suspicious noise at his neighbor's house. Officers were dispatched to the address provided. However, no one answered the door, and the house was empty. They surveyed the surrounding area, and through the glass door in the backyard, they spotted a silhouette resembling a person lying down. Once inside, the police confirmed that it wasn't a mistake. The silhouette indeed turned out to be a person. On the living room floor, they were faced with a horrifying scene. A middle-aged man lay in a pool of dried blood. His hands were bound, and his throat had been cut so deeply that he was nearly decapitated. What was just a routine check turned into a criminal investigation, the motives of which needed to be determined. The identity of the deceased was quickly established. He was 52-year-old local entrepreneur and owner of a chain of pizza restaurants, Harold Sasko. He was born on September 11, 1961 in Florida, and was the 10th child out of 12 in his family. His relatives described him as a responsible and organized person who was always a leader in everything. Harold worked hard from the age of 14, dreaming of becoming a successful entrepreneur and owning his own business. After studying for about 2 years in college in Oklahoma, Harold worked as an administrator in a chain of pizza restaurants in Texas, where he learned management and was able to save money to achieve his goals. In the 1990s, the Sasko family moved to Kansas. Here, the enterprising Harold opened his own pizzeria. The business was successful, and within a short span of time, Mr. Sasko opened another pizzeria in Topeka and one in Lawrence. But who could have done this to the respectable man, or could Harold have had a dark side to his personality that warranted what happened to him? Investigators quickly established that Harold Sasko had been living with 19-year-old Sarah McLynn for the last few years. However, she was not found at home and could have been the second victim of a brutal attack by a mysterious criminal. Sarah could have been the last person to see Harold alive, but where did the girl disappear to? In order to find the missing Sarah and uncover the mystery of the relationship between an adult man and a young woman, investigators had to piece together information about the complicated and secretive relationships that had been kept under wraps in the deceased Harold Sasko's home. Sarah Gonzalez McLynn was born in 1994 in Topeka, Kansas. She was a normal child, energetic, cheerful, sweet, and smiling. The girl was interested in everything new and fearlessly tried new hobbies. In her teenage years, she faced harassment from a neighbor, and her mental state was shaken. Sarah was very scared by the harsh behavior of the adult man. She felt helpless. During this time, disputes between her parents became more frequent, which aggravated the situation at home and had a detrimental effect on the girl's state. She had to grow up early to try to understand adult difficulties, but the immature psyche of a teenager did not yield the desired result, and Sarah began to drown her problems in alcohol. But the addiction to drinking did not bring relief, and Sarah, having a nervous breakdown, wanted to end her own life. After the attempt, she was hospitalized, where she underwent treatment in a psychiatric clinic for some time. Sarah dreamed of leaving her parents' home, where she was suffocated by the toxic atmosphere with parents who could not divide their property during the divorce. She started saving money to rent a room and move out. During a period of despair, Sarah met an adult man who calmed her and boosted her confidence. That was Harold. He ran a mentorship program for youth, where he met Sarah, who got a job at one of his restaurants. By the age of 16, she was already taking orders at the pizzeria counter and diligently saving money for her dream. During this time, Sarah was quite happy. She left the hated home for a place where she felt needed. She made friends and established a relationship with Harold. In turn, he became a second father to her, providing the love and attention she sorely lacked. One day, in a confidential conversation, Sarah honestly told him about her problems, and they moved in. Harold offered Sarah to move in with him temporarily until she found separate accommodation. Sarah's mother was against it, but the girl was adamant. After enrolling in college, Sarah moved in with her mentor. It was a forced measure, which Sarah believed should not last long. Harold paid for her education. They established a friendly relationship and grew close as father and daughter. And for a long time, that was indeed the case. Interviews with neighbors and witnesses showed that Harold was a pillar of support for Sarah after the difficulties she had experienced in her family. She found refuge with an adult friend. Harold was both a mentor and a friend to her, despite their significant age difference. After Harold Sasko's demise, the police needed to find Sarah McLynn as quickly as possible, as she could be in danger. Blood tests showed that all the blood belonged to the deceased, indicating that Sarah was alive and could indeed have been abducted. During the search, it was discovered that Sarah's biological father had reported her missing much earlier than the news of Harold's demise became known, but the police had been inactive, assuming teenage maximalism and her frequent departures from home. Detectives believed that the young woman might also have been a victim of an attack. Her search continued. However, the investigation considered various theories of the attack and crime. One of them was robbery. During the house inspection, it was found that some valuables and items had been stolen. Closets were partially emptied. Money and weapons owned by Harold were also stolen. There was disorder everywhere. Most of the items had been thrown out of the closets. After compiling lists of the stolen items, it became clear that only Sarah's belongings were missing. Her tablet, phone, and car were found on the parking lot at the house. For the investigators, this confirmed that the young woman had been abducted. Mr. Sasko's dog, Oliver, also disappeared without a trace. But why would the abductor take the dog? The disappearance of the dog puzzled the investigators, and they noted that Harold's car was also missing from the parking lot. The license plate was checked in the database, and the police began actively searching for the car. By tracking all the recordings from the city's surveillance cameras where the car could have been spotted, they managed to determine the direction of the suspected criminal, but the blurred frames did not allow them to identify him. Information about the stolen car with the possible criminal was distributed to nearby posts along the possible routes, but no clarifying information was received. While waiting for information about the car's movement, the investigators did not waste time. They actively questioned Sarah's friends and acquaintances, hoping to get more information about the unusual cohabitation of the young woman and the mature man. At that time, Harold Sasko had been married 3 times, but was divorced and lived only with Sarah. The fact that a 19-year-old woman was living with a 52-year-old man as friends was peculiar. But no other information about Sarah and Harold's relationship could be obtained. No one had ever seen them as a couple. Sarah had her own room in Harold's house. Could it be that this mature, well-to-do man really became a second father and mentor to the young, lost girl? It really seemed to be the case. Harold Sasko was viewed as a kind and sensitive person and a benefactor. His colleagues also confirmed no closeness between the boss and the employee. The investigation was at a standstill. After a critical 48 hours, Sarah McLynn had still not been found. Investigators were puzzled, but continued their search for the young woman. 3 days into the search efforts, an unexpected phone call to Sarah's parents' home turned the detectives' theory upside down. The awaited call was brief. The caller waited for an answer and then hung up silently. The police, anticipating a call from the suspected abductor, managed to trace it quickly. The caller's location was identified as a 24-hour store at a gas station in Bishop, Texas. Immediately heading to the location and reviewing surveillance footage, the police were shocked to recognize a female figure very similar to Sarah. The woman freely entered the store, made purchases, made the call, then left in Harold's car. Could it be possible that Sarah, whom the police were searching for as a victim of abduction, was actually the criminal and had fled, taking her beloved dog with her? On January 25, 2014, rangers in Everglades National Park in Dade County, Florida, found Sarah McLynn sleeping in the parked car with Oliver, Mr. Sasko's dog. Upon searching the car, several knives, an axe, and Harold's pistol were found. On February 1, 2014, after she waived her extradition hearing in Florida, Sarah was transported back to Kansas, where officers placed her in the Douglas County Jail. The car was seized and sent for inspection. Forensic analysis confirmed that the bloodied knife found was the weapon used in Harold Sasko's demise, but what led to such a brutal crime? During Sarah's interrogation, it was revealed that their relationship initially mirrored that of a father and daughter. He took care of her and told everyone she was his stepdaughter to avoid unnecessary questions. Sasko was aware of Sarah's difficult relationship with her parents. He knew she had been brutally assaulted by a man who had left her with cigarette-burn scars. She had tried to end her life, and she was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. Harold promised to take care of her, but the supposed sanctuary included unrestricted access to marijuana and alcohol. Cocaine and ecstasy were also available. He charged her rent, and she bought her own food. He gradually gained control over everything she did. After living together for about 6 months, Harold confessed his love for her. Sarah rejected him, but he persisted in his advances. Eventually, he demanded intimacy as a condition for her to stay with him. Harold took her salary, claiming it as compensation for what he spent on her upkeep daily. He threatened to sue her if she left. Harold degraded and insulted her daily. One day, Harold told Sarah that she was not attractive enough and that men preferred women with more voluptuous figures. With such an appearance, he said, she would never find true love and would never be appealing to men. Sarah objected but felt she had no choice. He paid for her to have a nose job and buttock implants. After these surgeries, Sarah's debt to Harold increased by $10,000. Her last paycheck from the pizzeria was $265. He demeaned her and demanded total submission. Out of desperation, Sarah began drinking alcohol and using psychotropic substances when Harold demanded intimacy. If she tried to resist, he would hold her down. Taking advantage of Sarah's weakened state, Harold repeatedly forced himself on her, and she eventually entered into a relationship with him at his insistence. Sarah fell into a state of depression from which she sought to hide under Harold's supposed protection. She became increasingly restrained and withdrawn. She suffered from victim syndrome and was afraid to leave him or tell anyone. She saw only one way out of her moral confinement, ending her partner's life. Sarah confessed that she made the decision 5 days before the act. On January 14th, Harold came home late in the evening and started working on the sound system. At one point, he asked Sarah to bring him a beer. Knowing that if he drank, he would force himself on her, she decided to act. She added crushed sleeping pills to the beer, which she had prepared in advance. After some time, Harold lost consciousness. Sarah tied his ankles and wrists with zip ties. Then she took a hunting knife and inflicted a deep wound on his neck. During the interrogation, Sarah confessed that, at one moment, she reconsidered her decision to take his life, but Harold was already bleeding out, and she felt she had no choice but to finish what she started. With renewed fury, she continued to stab him in the neck with relentless force, nearly decapitating him. Then Sarah took a shower, packed her belongings, and left in Harold's car, taking Oliver, the dog she had cared for. First, she headed to Texas, then to Florida to see the ocean. That's where the Rangers detained her. The trial for the demise of Harold Sasko began on March 5, 2015, at the Douglas County Courthouse. In his opening statement, Prosecutor Charles Branson told the jury that Sarah McLynn had meticulously planned Harold Sasko's end. Lawrence Police Detective Robert Brown testified for the prosecution, showing that before the act, Sarah McLynn had made Google searches using the phrase, "vulnerable places on the neck." She confessed to inflicting knife wounds on the victim and then cutting his throat. When the detective asked her why she ended Mr. Sasko's life, she replied, "I wanted someone to die." Because of these words, the trial focused on her ability to form the intent to commit the act. However, in a private meeting with the judge prior to the trial, Prosecutor Charles Branson stated that it would be inappropriate for the jury to hear about Harold Sasko's cruel treatment of Sarah McLynn, and he intentionally omitted this information. He believed that the details of the accusations would be inappropriate at the trial stage because they would merely elicit sympathy for the defendant without any supporting evidence. Branson did not want the years of domestic abuse to become public knowledge. Defense attorney Carl Cornwell agreed with the restrictions on presenting evidence of cruel treatment, which he could have introduced in court. Instead, he tried to convince the jury that Sarah was mentally unstable and unable to fully comprehend her actions. Carl Cornwell argued that Douglas County Judge Paula Martin should send the accused, Sarah McLynn, to a state hospital rather than prison. and if a prison sentence was to be decided, sentence her to 25 years due to her mental illness. However, prosecutor David Melton criticized the defense's portrayal of Sarah as a victim. He added that a psychological evaluation at Larned State Hospital, an impartial entity, showed that McClin did not meet the criteria for dissociative identity disorder. The district judge reported that she had been found to have borderline personality disorder with antisocial tendencies. The report also stated that Sarah McClin exaggerated the symptoms of her mental illness. In his courtroom address, the prosecutor added that the crime was not committed by a little sweet girl, but by a methodical and far-sighted criminal who had planned it in advance and intentionally left her mobile phone behind to avoid being tracked. In his closing statement, Prosecutor Melton said that in his legal career, he had never encountered something so reprehensible and brutal as the crime committed against Harold Sasko, and therefore the defendant deserved a sentence ranging from 50 years to life imprisonment.
Some crimes are so evil, so horrendous, that they warrant harsher punishment, Melton said. He argued that Sarah could have chosen a different method, such as suffocation, overdose, or poisoning Sasko. But the fact that McClin forcefully penetrated Sasko's carotid artery with a long knife spoke to the horror of the act. Addressing the court, the prosecutor repeatedly emphasized that she chose a knife because she wanted to prolong the experience of the act and likely enjoyed it greatly. After considering the arguments, psychological assessments, requests from relatives, and letters to the court, Martin ultimately decided that there is no evidence to support commitment to a psychiatric facility instead of prison, and that the act was committed in a disgusting, barbaric, and brutal manner. Douglas County Judge Paula Martin sentenced Sarah Gonzalez McClin to 50 years in prison. She must serve at least 50 years before becoming eligible for parole, at which time she will be nearly 70 years old. After the sentencing, Sarah apologized to her own family and Harold Sasko's family. Sarah has appealed the sentence based on the provision of ineffective counsel. In the meantime, the defense lawyers began preparing a clemency petition and uncovered necessary evidence of abuse and the dark side of Harold Sasko that had not been presented to the jury during the trial. It turned out that during the search for Sarah, a significant number of crucial clues were overlooked. After all, the investigation's attention was occupied with investigating a crime against life, not proving domestic abuse. An examination of Harold Sasko's phone confirmed that he had repeatedly shown interest in child-explicit material. He downloaded hundreds of videos to his phone and visited X-rated sites discussing children, teenagers, and zoophilia. At least 20 times, he visited websites where men were intimate or appeared to be intimate with women who seemed to be asleep. The police found a camera and flash drives on a desk in Sasko's bedroom. A detective stated that the images found on the flash drives showed that Sasko and Sarah McClin were just friends who spent time together. The defense attorneys were not allowed to review the files. Sarah was shocked and confused when the evidence of harsh treatment was not presented in court. She did not give up on proving that at the moment of ending her aggressor's life, she saw no other way to save herself.
On March 20th, 2015, after deliberating for just 4 hours, the jury found Sarah Gonzalez McClin guilty of first-degree premeditated homicide with aggravating circumstances, unaware of the months of harsh treatment that preceded her dreadful crime. Now her lawyers hope to get her out of prison, convincing the governor to pardon her, which is a long-term attempt to correct what they consider an injustice. In 2021, the newly elected district attorney of Douglas County, Susana Valdez, struck a stunning deal. The sentence for Sarah McClin was reduced by half in exchange for waiving the right to appeal. The case of Sarah McClin is one of the most confusing and recurring institutional failures where, in the pursuit of justice, the truth remains sidelined. Currently, Sarah Gonzalez McClin remains incarcerated at the correctional facility in Topeka, Kansas. The earliest she can be released is in 2039, but strangely enough, prison gave Sarah a chance to heal. In her only interview, she admitted that being locked up was the biggest relief for her. She found time to reflect on what had happened. She wrote letters to God, trying to cope with her shame. In prison, she trains Labrador and Golden Retrievers for service in an organization based in Washington, Kansas. Sarah says that the dogs have healed her more than she could have ever imagined. In her statement, Sarah said that since she's been in prison, she's dedicated every day to becoming better, not just for herself, but for her family and society. I will continue to ensure that everything that happened was not in vain, as I am no longer the young woman who felt hopeless and didn't know what to do. At the scene where Harold Sasko's life was ended, the word freedom was written on the wall in blood, a word the investigators initially struggled to decipher. During questioning, Sarah replied that she wrote what she felt after committing the crime. Paradoxically, it was in prison that Sarah Gonzalez McLean found her freedom. In 2012, the family of one of the richest people in Brazil, businessman Marcos Matsunaga, became the center of attention after Marcos disappeared on the eve of a major billion-dollar deal. The case shocked the whole country, and photos of the inconsolable widow of the millionaire did not leave the front pages of the leading national publications. Initially, as the main version, the police considered the intrigues of competitors who could kidnap and get rid of the businessman in order to disrupt the upcoming deal. However, the revealed truth turned out to be much more cruel and terrible. The story of a cold-blooded murder and a monstrous attempt to cover up the crime formed the basis of several documentaries. Who is Marcos Matsunaga? Entrepreneur Marcos Matsunaga was one of the richest people in Brazil and ran a family business producing various food products, Yoki. The company was founded by Marcos's grandfather, who had once emigrated across the ocean. His name was Yoshizo Kitano, actually, from the first letters of the surname and first name of the founder, and the name of the brand was formed. The foundation of the future business empire was laid in the middle of the last century. It is noteworthy that it all started with a small flour milling enterprise, which managed not only to survive, but also thrive during the years of crisis and war, and then transformed into a huge company with a worldwide reputation and the widest range of products. Marcos was born into a wealthy family, and from an early age he knew no denial of anything. He did not have to build and develop his business from scratch, because he inherited everything that his grandfather and father had created, becoming the CEO of the family food company. He had every chance to become the first billionaire in his family, and he strived for this almost all his conscious life, but such grandiose plans were not destined to materialize. Everyone who was personally acquainted with Marcos characterized him as a good and quite talented businessman, who managed not only to save, but also to multiply the family capital, several times increasing profits. But he was not an easy man. Capricious, arrogant, with a heavy character, and a constant desire to control everyone who was near him. In addition, the businessman was far from handsome in appearance. He suffered from childhood overweight, had problems with vision, because of which he wore glasses, and he was also short in stature and somewhat clumsy. All this from an early age created a lot of problems for the boy when communicating with his peers. He had almost no friends and female representatives of the female sex, and had all shunned this strange and peculiar guy. Marcos, for a long time, all failed to build a long and serious relationship with anyone, because beyond a couple of dates, it did not go. Even his own business and multi-million-dollar inheritance did not make him an enviable and desirable bachelor. He repulsed women with his arrogance and egoism, so Marcos often used the services of escorts and representatives of the ancient profession. There is practically no information about the entrepreneur's first wife in open sources. It is only known that he did not marry out of great love or passion, but rather out of desperation and at the insistence of his relatives. Despite this, the marriage lasted several years, although both spouses almost immediately began to regret their decision to start a family. At first, the young wife tried to put up with the complex character of the businessman, hoping that in time they will manage to become a happy couple where both support and understand each other. But the young woman was wrong, and over the years they only increasingly distanced from each other. Also, Marcos constantly cheated on her and did not even try to hide it or somehow justify it. and he looked for mistresses mainly on websites where girls offered intimacy for money. Alice was one of those girls. She was an escort, and her portfolio was available on the relevant platforms. It was there that the businessman noticed a bright, attractive blonde with a beautiful figure and began to regularly invite her on dates, generously paying for them. Alice was 6 years younger than him. She was born and raised in a very poor and dysfunctional family living in one of the most crime-ridden areas of the city. Alice didn't know her own father. Her mother was a heavy drinker, and she was involved with men who shared her addiction. The girl had a hard and joyless childhood. At a very young age, she was repeatedly beaten, harassed, and abused by her mother's roommates. Barely finished school, Alice literally ran away from home and forever left the neighborhood in which she grew up. The girl took nursing courses, after which she got a job at a hospice. However, she soon realized that caring for dying patients is far from the limit of her dreams and abilities. In addition, sensitive and vulnerable young woman quickly became attached to people, and the death of each patient perceived as a personal tragedy. A few years later, Alice decided to get a higher education and completely change her occupation. Her choice fell on the law, which she considered a promising occupation, opening in life almost all the doors. She had long been preparing for admission and was able to score the required number of points in the entrance exams, but to pay for her studies from her modest salary as a nurse, she could not. Alice had no one to help her, because she had severed all ties with her relatives after she left home. Then, young, pretty Alice, with a slender figure, decided to earn on her external data and registered on a site specializing in the provision of escort services. There she was helped to create a bright personal page, and soon wealthy men themselves began to show interest in the young blonde beauty. Escorting and providing intimate services brought Alice a good income, allowing her to pay for her studies and fully support herself. But she planned to leave this specific occupation as soon as she got her diploma and got a job in her specialty. During this period, Alice met Marcos, who became one of her regular customers. He was generous with gifts and met regularly with Alice without hiding from anyone. She knew that the businessman was married, but at the time she couldn't have dreamed that one of the richest men in the country would leave his wife for her. The story of Alice Matsunaga was like a Cinderella tale. A poor girl from a disadvantaged family, engaged in providing escort services, meets a multi-millionaire who soon falls madly in love with her. Marcos really literally lost his head, but now it is impossible to say for sure whether Alice herself made efforts to do so. After about 6 months, Marcos realized that he wanted not just to date his new young mistress, but to be with her permanently. He, without a second thought and regret, filed for divorce from his first wife and began to present everyone Alice as his fiancée. For obvious reasons, the businessman did not want anyone to know about how he met his chosen one and what she earned a living. Therefore, the couple came up with a quite ordinary story of a casual acquaintance in a cafe and adhered to this version. Even the closest relatives and few friends of Marcos did not guess anything. However, Alice in the family Matsunaga received not too welcome. The parents of the entrepreneur guessed that this attractive young person put into action all her charm to fall in love with the rich but ugly Marcos. And now she was going to great lengths to pretend that she did not notice his hard character. Nevertheless, when Marcos announced his intention to divorce his first wife and marry Alice, no one strongly objected. The businessman arranged a lavish wedding in the traditional style, with a white dress, a large number of guests, and a huge tiered cake. After that, he moved his wife to his huge and luxurious mansion, where she became a full-fledged mistress. Matsunagi had long been known as an avid collector of expensive wines and rare weapons. For wines in his house was built a huge cellar, where the bottles were carefully sorted by year and country. And for weapons, the house had a secret room, on the walls of which from floor to ceiling flaunted firearms and edged weapons. Marcos was very proud of his collections and was constantly engaged in their replenishment. However, in addition, his house was literally full of antiques, luxury goods, and modern art, which tastelessly hung on the walls and stood literally on all surfaces. Soon after the wedding, the couple decided that they were ready to have an heir, but despite all their efforts, Alice for a long time did not get pregnant naturally. Then the couple decided to resort to the procedure of in vitro fertilization, but even here success awaited them far from immediately. When their common daughter was born, it seemed that the happiness of the couple now has no limits. The young parents were engaged in the education of the long-awaited baby girl, made plans for the future, and when the girl grew up a little, the whole family began to travel the world, getting acquainted with different cultures and traditions. Their daughter was a real little princess who was brought up in love, care, and luxury. But the couple had one very specific common hobby: hunting large animals. Although it would be more correct to say that it was always a hobby of Marcos, who at different times tried to join it to his chosen women and his first wife. But most women did not just dislike this activity, it frankly repulsed them. The businessman no longer hoped that he would meet someone who would share his passion. Now many believe that Alice became interested in hunting to win even more favor Marcos and conquer his heart. At first, they visited shooting ranges together, where Alice learned how to handle different types of firearms, and afterward they went into the woods together to hunt wild animals. Alice felt no pity when she took the lives of animals and treated it as a kind of competition. Either you do it or you don't. Marcos liked this approach, and he liked to watch his wife handle her weapons and stalk her prey. He also taught her how to skin and carve wild boars, deer, and other forest creatures. Together they skinned them and separated body parts using large knives, special cleavers, and axes. In addition, the family did not have cats or dogs as pets, but poisonous snakes for which special terrariums were built, with conditions as close as possible to their natural habitat. It was the realization of another long-time dream of Marcos, who adored snakes, but his first wife did not approve of the idea of having a home terrarium. Alice had really bought Marcos off by sharing his rather strange hobbies. In the spring of 2012, the entrepreneur was preparing to make perhaps the main deal of his life and career, which would make him a billionaire and take his income to a whole new level. He was actively negotiating with several business partners, going to sell the family company, and the proceeds of the huge sum of money to invest in a new profitable business. At home at this time, Matsunaga rarely appeared because he was completely absorbed in work and the realization of his grandiose plans. He and his wife moved into an elite apartment complex located in the business center of the city, not far from the main office of the businessman's company. Marcos was away almost all the time, while his young wife was bored alone in a luxurious apartment with a panoramic view of the city. The businessman's work schedule was scheduled literally by the minute. He was lost in meetings, business meetings, and consultations with specialists. Often he did not even spend the night at home, but promised his wife that as soon as the deal was done, their lives would be completely changed and transformed. On May 19, 2012, on the eve of the deal for $1 billion, the entrepreneur disappeared without a trace. His wife reported the incident only the next day because she believed that Marcos at work. According to Alice, in the evening he was scheduled a meeting, which could last into the night, and early in the morning, her husband was to meet with a business partner, so he took some things, warned that, most likely to spend the night in the office, and then go straight to the deal. When the next day Marcos did not return home and stopped answering his phone, Alice became concerned and reported him missing. The police immediately found out that the entrepreneur did not show up for a meeting in the evening or an important meeting in the morning, which he simply could not miss. In this regard, there was immediately a version that the millionaire was kidnapped, and most likely, his family in the coming hours will receive ransom demands. But 24 hours passed. Then the second, no ransom demands were received, and hopes that Matsunaga was still alive were literally melting before our eyes.
Investigators at this time did not sit idle and began to question relatives, friends, and business partners of the businessman, trying to find out whether he had enemies and who could be beneficial to his disappearance or the disruption of the upcoming deal. However, despite all efforts, it was not possible to find a specific person or people who might have wished the death of the businessman. He ran his business competently, was able to prioritize and plan his steps ahead, so that his strategic decisions made almost everyone always benefited. A few days later, after taking her little daughter, Alice came to the home of her father-in-law and mother-in-law to tell what she had not dared to tell the police.
The young woman with tears in her eyes said that her husband has long been cheating on her with a girl named Natasha Villarreal Lima and did not hide it. True, after several major quarrels and threats to divorce, Marcos promised that he would leave the mistress for the sake of preserving the family. In fact, the man did not stop meeting with Natasha, but began to do it more carefully, so as not to provoke another family scandals. The wife guessed everything and decided to hire a private detective to gather evidence of the businessman's infidelity. Alice had photographs and videos of her husband on romantic dates with the same Natasha. It was noteworthy that he took his new girlfriend to the same restaurants and entertainment venues that he and his wife frequented and where everyone knew him. Marcos seemed to demonstrate to others how much he disdained his wife and can openly cheat on her without hiding from anyone. As it later turned out, Natasha Lima businessman found on the same site escort services where he once met Alice. They met for about 5 months, and during that time he gave her an expensive car and also paid a large sum of money for Natasha to remove her profile from the site. The available photos and videos proving her husband's cheating, the daughter-in-law presented to Marcos's parents. She also added that she had shown all this to Marcos the day before his disappearance, but instead of making excuses and asking for forgiveness, he simply packed his things, told his wife that he was leaving her, and then left their apartment and disappeared without a trace. Based on Alice's story, her husband, giving in to passion, simply decided to run away with a new mistress. But everyone who knew Matsunaga unanimously asserted that he could not just leave the business and disappear because he was too serious about the business, which for decades built his family. Answers to many questions were found about a week later, when in a deserted area, 100 kilometers from the house of the businessman, a passerby found scattered garbage bags, inside which were the remains of a human body. The man immediately reported the gruesome discovery to the police, and it soon became clear that the victim was Marcos Matsunaga, who was searched for all over the country. Experts determined that the businessman was killed by a shot to the head, after which his body was dismembered, packed into garbage bags, and taken to the outskirts of the city. It was noteworthy that the murderer, according to the pathologists, was either a surgeon or an experienced butcher who was proficient with a carving knife. Such a conclusion was inevitable, based on how accurately and professionally the cuts were made in the right places to separate the body parts from each other. At the first stage of the investigation did not have any concrete leads, so it was decided to start the investigation from the place where the deceased man was last seen alive. Elite residential complex where Marcos lived with his wife and daughter was equipped with numerous video surveillance cameras, the records of which began to be scrutinized. It turned out that the evening before the disappearance, the couple ordered food delivery home. On the recordings of the camera in the elevator was seen as Marcos goes down to the first floor and then comes back with boxes of pizza in his hands. He enters his apartment and never leaves it again, not that evening, not at night, and not the next day. Matsunagi seems to disappear into his own home, but in the morning his wife leaves the apartment with 3 large wheeled suitcases. The footage shows that the suitcases are very heavy, and she moves them with great difficulty. The investigators had already guessed what kind of luggage it was. On the same day, the businessman's widow was taken into custody and brought to the police station to testify. At first, she tried to deny everything and stuck to the initial version that her husband had left her for a mistress. But when she was shown the elevator footage, she burst into tears and started talking. According to Alice, their family life has long since broken down, and from the former idyll is not left a trace. Her husband humiliated her, constantly reproached her with the work in the escort, saying that he pulled her out of the mud and also stated that she was a bad mother for their daughter. He also tried to control literally every move his wife made, not allowing her to make friends. When Alice once raised the topic of divorce, Marcos laughed and replied that he would leave her with nothing, take the child, and forbid her to see him. Alice said that on that fateful evening she showed her husband received from the detective pictures, which were captured Marcos with his mistress, but he only made him angry. He slapped his wife, and then, according to her, everything was as if in a fog. Alice does not remember how she got a gun in her hands, from which she shot her husband, and later, realizing what had happened, she decided to dispose of the body, making it look as if he disappeared without a trace. Alice had experience as a nurse and was familiar with human anatomy, and her husband had taught her how to skin and cut up animal carcasses for which they had the necessary tools at home. All that followed was a matter of technique. While Alice was cutting up and bagging her husband's body, their young daughter was sleeping peacefully in the next room. From the beginning, Alice's testimony raised many doubts and questions. In addition, it soon became clear that the very pictures and videos proving Marcos's cheating, his wife received from the hands of a private detective only on May 20th, that is, after she had killed her husband. Then, as I said, Alice took these photos and videos to the parents of the businessman, saying that Marcos had abandoned her by running away with his mistress. We also managed to find Natasha Lima, who appeared in court as a witness. According to her, Marcos himself wanted a divorce, but frankly afraid of his wife, saying that she was mentally unstable and capable of terrible things. The last time Natasha saw her lover the day before his disappearance, he complained about the constant scandals in the family and said that after the sale of the company is going to move to live in Florida, where he plans to establish a new company. Taking Alice with him was not part of his plans. He was going to divorce her and forget her like a terrible dream. Another terrible discovery was the discovery by experts of blood in the lungs of the dead man, which indicated that Marcos was still alive and trying to breathe when his wife separated his head from the body. This is wild and horrifying. Alice herself vehemently denied this, insisting that he died instantly from a bullet. The pathologist also found that the same bullet entered Marcos's head at a rather odd angle, as if he was sitting or lying down, not expecting to be shot. So he didn't even try to defend himself or dodge. This contradicted Alice's account of her husband attacking her and her trying to defend herself. On top of that, almost all the witnesses who testified at the trial denied that Matsunaga could have hit his wife. Yes, he had a difficult character, could say various hurtful words, but in life never raised a hand on anyone. Everything looked as if Alice herself made up this episode, because Marcos could not refute anything. As a result, the court found Alice guilty of premeditated murder with particular cruelty and attempting to conceal the crime. Alice Matsunaga was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which many considered an extremely lenient punishment for such a crime. The parents of the deceased man are now responsible for the upbringing of their daughter.